Welcome to the speaker series to celebrate the publication by Hoover Press of Fanning the Flames, Propaganda in Modern Japan. Good afternoon, I'm Ueda, curator of the Japanese Diaspora Collection at the Hoover Institution Library Archives and editor of the book. The book and the exhibit bring together scholarly essays and archival material from Hoover and detail the role of Japanese propaganda in fostering national identity and mobilizing participation in the country's transformation and wartime activities, beginning with the first Sino-Japanese War in 1894 and continuing to the end of World War II. First, allow me to thank my colleagues at the Library and Archives and the Hoover Press. Their exceptional teamwork made the publication and upcoming exhibit a beautiful production. Of course, the community of Hoover overseers and the other supporters of the institution, without whom nothing would be possible. We are delighted to have Professor Sharalyn Orbaugh as our guest speaker today. Her talk is titled Kamishibai, or Paper Plays, and the Mobilization of Women in Wartime Japan. Professor Orbaugh specializes in modern Japanese literature and popular culture and teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses at University of British Columbia, where she also serves as head of the Asian Studies Department. She's the author of Japanese fiction of the Allied occupation, Brill publication in 2007, and of course, propaganda performed Kamishibai in Japan's 15-year war, again from Brill in 2015. She's also the editor of a forthcoming reference work, The Columbia Companion to Modern Japanese Literature. She received her PhD in Far Eastern Languages and Literatures from the University of Michigan and spent 6 years at UC Berkeley before joining UBC in 1997. After Professor Orbaugh's talk, we'll have a Q&A session. Thank you so much for submitting questions in advance. We try to answer as many as possible. And if you have additional questions, please use the Q&A function. Without further ado, please welcome Professor Orbaugh.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ueda, for that introduction and for inviting me to be a part of this Fanning the Flames speaker series. I'd like to thank you and everybody at the Hoover Institution and Stanford University who made this possible. My topic is the mobilization of Japanese women through the medium of Kamishibai during the 15 years of war, starting with the Manchurian incident in 1931 and ending in 1945 with the end of World War II. My area of specialization is not history, but literature. And I look at literature, film, and popular culture. So I approach the issue of propaganda from that point of view. The questions that interest me are, how were narrative media, such as fiction, film, theater, and so on, how were they used to deliver pro-war messages to the inhabitants of Japan and its colonies? Also, what can a close look at the contents of those propaganda media tell us about the Japanese government's priorities and concerns vis-a-vis various demographic groups? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. As I think is clear from my title, I will be focusing today on Kamishibai as they were used for propaganda purposes. This is a large and as yet very much understudied field, but you can find two wonderfully informative essays about it in the Fanning the Flames volume edited by Dr. Ueda, which also includes a wealth of illustration from various Kamishibai plays. And if you want to look more deeply at the topic, you can look at my book that Dr. Ueda just mentioned, Propaganda Performed Kamishibai in Japan's 15-year war, which also includes a large number of illustrations from and translations of wartime Kamishibai plays. So to get started, what is Kamishibai? The original form of the medium started in the late 1920s as a kind of street entertainment for children. But propagandistic government-sponsored Kamishibai, of which these are not, these are still images of the street performance, but propagandistic government-sponsored Kamishibai performances did begin very early in 1932 to commemorate the first anniversary of the Manchurian incident. But it wasn't until 1937, when the Second Sino-Japanese War was declared and the entire nation was put on a war footing, that Kamishibai was formally and extensively pressed into service for the mobilization of the populace. At that point, a quasi-governmental organization called the Nippon Kyoiku Kamishibai Kyokai, which we might translate as the Japanese Association for Educational Kamishibai, began producing what they called kokusaku kamishibai, that is national policy plays, to educate and to entertain, as those plays delivered government-approved messages intended to mobilize the populace behind the war effort. Kamishibai was a very interesting medium for propaganda. Most basically, it is a way of narrating illustrated stories. So it combines image, text, and performance. Here we see it in its original form as a street entertainment for children. On a bicycle-mounted stage, cardboard panels with an illustration on one side and the script on the other are revealed one by one as the performer brings the dialogue to life with a variety of voices, sound effects, and musical instruments. You can see that the drum in the left-hand picture. Although this performance medium became popular very quickly in the late 1920s and early 1930s and spread to all parts of Japan's cities, it was particularly associated with the poorer neighborhoods where entertainment media were scarce. After 1938, so that's after the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the production and censorship of Kamishibai came to be overseen by the Shokokumin Bunka Kyokai, the Association for Children's Culture, reflecting the fact that Kamishibai was still closely associated in most people's minds with children. But in fact, at least 70% of the propaganda Kamishibai plays produced during the war were aimed at an adult or a mixed age audience. This estimate comes from Kamishibai historian Kamichi Chizuko, but I must say that from my own experience of reading and collecting wartime Kamishibai plays, my experience bears out her numbers. We can see exactly such a mixed age audience here in this photograph of a wartime performance. You will notice that the stage is no longer mounted on a bicycle, and instead is carried around like it can be folded up and carried around like a small suitcase and then set up, as you see here, for the performance. Each wartime play consisted of around 20 cards or panels, again, with an illustration on the side facing the audience, and then the script on the other side to be read by the performer. It's a notable fact that whereas entertainment Kamishibai performers were almost exclusively men, the government recruited a large number of young women to perform propaganda plays, together with a number of men as well. Kamishibai plays were cheap to make and easy to distribute, and therefore among the most widely accessed media in wartime Japan. They could be and were sent out to every corner of the country, and also to every far-flung outpost of the colonies. We see here one in performance in China, and Kamishibai on the back of bicycles in what was called Indochina at the time. Kamishibai were often required viewing for particular groups, although they were basically touted as entertainment. A munitions factory worker, for example, might find that his lunch break would include the compulsory viewing of a Kamishibai play as a treat. The leader of an agricultural cooperative might invite the members of the group to a compulsory town hall viewing in the evening. An urban widow might be regaled with a Kamishibai play as part of her neighborhood associations. Children in schools on the Japanese main islands or in colonial Korea or in Manchuria might be required to perform government-sponsored Kamishibai plays for each other or for parents' groups. Now, despite the mandatory nature of many of these contexts, there is little evidence to suggest that viewers consider these occasions as coercive. On the contrary, wartime diaries and memoirs that do mention Kamishibai tend to describe such performances as a pleasant diversion in what was otherwise sometimes a bleak atmosphere. Another significant feature of Kamishibai as a medium for mobilization propaganda is the narrative component. These were plays that told stories. In some cases, especially in the early years of the war, The story element was rudimentary at best, and the majority of the play was taken up with slogans and instruction. As we can see here in these examples from, in this case, a play that teaches people how to recognize spies and prevent dangerous gossip, or this one, which is in part about how to deal with the incendiary bombs and the fires that result from them, or this one about keeping your home safe from thieves. From 1938 to about 1942, there are quite a few of these how-to sorts of instructional plays. But as propaganda Kamishibai producers gained experience with the medium, they began to turn more frequently to fictional or fictionalized stories with compelling, relatable characters and sophisticated and sometimes beautiful illustrations, as we shall see. Because Kamishibai plays were so cheap to make and easy to transport, it was possible to quickly produce and distribute any number of plays, each one addressed toward the particular issues or concerns of a specific demographic group. Just as the original form of Kamishibai, the entertainment form on the streets for children, was centered in the poorer areas of the cities, propaganda Kamishibai plays too were, in large part, aimed at farmers in the countryside and blue-collar workers in the city, as well as more generally just at women and children and other people who were imagined to be less sophisticated and possibly only marginally literate. But there was also a significant percentage of plays aimed at well-educated middle-class men and women too. I'm going to give you a quick kind of kaleidoscopic overview of different demographics that were addressed by propaganda Kamishibai plays. So here we see, for example, a couple of plays aimed at male shopkeepers and artisans, trying to convince them to put aside profit or family pride in favor of contributing to the war effort. There were many, many, many plays aimed at farmers, generally encouraging increased production of food for the soldiers, but also fostering pride in their contributions to the war and praising farmers' willingness to give up the labor of their sons to allow those sons to become soldiers. There were plays aimed at scientists or engineers, generally with the message of trying to convince them to use their intellect and skills toward the war effort rather than pure research. There were plays for rural girls, and we'll look at one of those in a moment. There were plays for rural teenage boys, such as this one, which this is towards the end of the war. So rather than encouraging boys to work hard on the farm, which is what some earlier plays were about, this particular one is encouraging young farming boys to consider going into the Shonen Hikohei program, which is the youth pilot program, in which the life expectancy was tragically short. There were plays for impoverished young boys in the city, such as this one, who were encouraged to provide comfort to the soldiers through letters and what were called imonbukuro. Those were bags filled with small treats like candy or warm socks. What we see here is a play encouraging girls to knit socks for soldiers. There were plays for impoverished families in the countryside. And in many cases, notably, these plays included sort of bilingual scripts with one in standard Japanese and one in the local dialect. There were plays aimed at Korean youth and their families, which is this one, which is urging young Korean men to join the military, the Japanese military. And you'll notice that it too is bilingual with a Japanese and Hangul script. This is a play aimed at Korean older people, in this case, an elderly man, but there are other plays aimed at just adult men who are resistant to the idea of learning Japanese. And again, this play is bilingual in both Korean and Japanese. And finally, there were plays in Manchuria with bilingual scripts in Chinese and Japanese, for performance there. Plus the many, many, many plays that were performed about and for soldiers. So that quick tour does not by any means exhaust the very wide variety of different groups that were addressed or the messages promulgated by Propaganda Kamishibai. Among all the plays produced for these different demographics, there are comical stories, often illustrated, as you see, with kind of cartoonish characters, cartoonish style. There were heartwarming stories, and many of these take place in the countryside and evoke kind of an atmosphere of deep Japan, deep rural Japan. And many stories of pain and grief and loss. There were all kinds, kind of every genre and every illustration style that you can imagine. But again, one of the things that distinguishes Kamishibai as a medium for propaganda is that the messages are embedded in complex narratives with, as you can see, compelling illustrations. As I mentioned, there are some plays that are primarily intended to convey information, or plays that straightforwardly exhort people to commit to particular behaviors, such as buying, in this case, ammunition stamps or war bonds, or some of them tout imperialist slogans that were popular at the time. This one is put into practice the way of the imperial subject, or this one aimed at women, zeitaku wa tekida, basically luxury is the enemy. So there were plays that relied heavily on these kinds of slogans, but the overwhelming majority of plays are miniature dramas that present admirable and relatable characters whose behaviors and attitudes the viewers were implicitly invited to emulate. So what I hope to have conveyed to you so far is the wide range of topics, illustration styles, and intended audience for Propaganda Kamishibai. But given that the majority of them were created by one production company, the one I mentioned a moment ago, the Nippon Kyoiku Kamishibai Kyokai, it's perhaps not surprising that we also find many repeated images or repeated plot points. These repetitions are significant because they reveal which images were considered particularly potent and which messages were considered particularly crucial. For example, one of the main purposes of Japanese propaganda was to encourage all inhabitants of the colonies and conquered territories. So everybody on the main islands, the Naichi, and everybody in the conquered territories, the Gaichi, everyone, whether soldier or civilian, old or young, were encouraged to see themselves as one team of 100 million souls, all working together toward the same shared goal, which was victory in the war. Therefore, in order to emphasize this message of tight connection between the soldiers on the battlefield and the people on the home front, a very large number of Kamishibai plays feature letters. In some cases, we see letters from children received by soldiers, which inspire those soldiers to keep fighting hard and eventually to anshin shite shinu, as the plays often say, that is, to die with no regrets or worries. There are many letters from soldiers to children, motivating those children to continue working hard on the home front to support the soldiers who are sacrificing so much on their behalf. There are letters from soldiers to their fathers, motivating those fathers to put aside their normal concerns to support the efforts of their sons. For example, by going to work in a munitions factory or by buying postal savings bonds. And finally, letters from sons to mothers and mothers to sons are particularly common, serving as vehicles where their mutual love, devotion, and gratitude can be expressed in ways impossible in daily life. And I'll return to this topic in just a minute. Other repeated scenes include groups of people going to Nijubashi at the Imperial Palace grounds in Tokyo and bowing in gratitude to the emperor. The emperor as such is depicted in no Kamishibai play that I have ever seen, nor even directly mentioned. So this kind of scene at the Imperial Palace stands in for the devotion of the people toward the unnamed emperor and his imperial project. And then there are several visual tropes that are specific to the many, many plays about soldiers. And here's one of them. It's kind of soldiers as bridge, right? And this is an interesting recurring image because it rarely occurs as an actual part of the storyline, right? We don't get told that the soldiers are making this bridge and marching across it. Instead, it's used in the illustration as a visual metaphor for a message stressed throughout Japanese World War II propaganda, but nowhere better than in Kamishibai. And that message is, look how our stalwart soldiers are providing support for the war effort with their very bodies. How can you not live up to their admirable example? It would be moshiwakenai. That is, it would be unforgivable, ungrateful of you to slack off on your efforts when they are overcoming obstacles by dint of sheer willpower and physical courage. A similar image is of one soldier, usually blinded from an injury, carrying another soldier who has been lamed by injury to his legs, with the seeing man telling the blind man where to go. Even though both are seriously wounded, by working together, they can still function in a way that serves the imperial cause, usually by delivering a crucial message back to headquarters regarding a troop under fire that needs reinforcements, that kind of thing. This trope also underscores the idea of soldiers as gallant and mutually supportive. Compared to the mobilization propaganda in most other nations of World War II, in Japan, the death of soldiers is often explicitly narrated, and pictorialized, so much so that it too becomes a visual trope. This functions as part of the same rhetoric of moshiwakenai. How ungrateful it would be of the viewer to refuse to sacrifice their comfort, their money, and even their physical well-being for the war effort when soldiers are sacrificing their very lives, as we see in these images. And then finally, what I call the pietà, as it is somewhat reminiscent of a trope that we find in religious iconography. The depiction of a soldier's death is frequently followed by an illustration of his dying or dead body being cradled by his commander or a comrade, emphasizing the strong emotional ties among the soldiers and the feeling of personalized tragedy evoked by every single death. Parents on the home front may know that their soldier son is in danger of injury or death, but through viewing these plays, they have the comfort of believing that their child is known and loved by his fellow troops, not simply an anonymous body among many on the battlefield. Now, I've used up just about half my time already with these general descriptions, so I'm now going to focus in on women. What kind of plays were aimed at women? What kind of behaviors were encouraged in those plays? And what kinds of visual or narrative tropes do we find reinforcing these messages? Women had important roles to play in Japan's war effort. Some in jobs that were directly related to the war, such as nursing or work in a munitions or aircraft factory, but also less obvious, but no less crucial responsibilities, like growing food in urban gardens, managing rationing and other neighborhood association programs, recycling and repurposing of clothing and other goods, and bearing and raising the young people who would become soldiers. After 1942, when the bombing of the main islands became fairly frequent, women were also charged with putting out fires from incendiary bombs. More generally, women had to take over social and familial responsibilities that had formerly been handled by husbands, fathers, and brothers, now off at the battlefield. All of these tasks were of crucial importance if the war were to be successful, so it's no surprise that women were intensively mobilized through a wide range of propaganda media. Mass market magazines, as we see here, in popular film, in radio shows, and very, very frequently in images of themselves as stalwart, capable, courageous, and admirable in their willingness to sacrifice themselves for their families and for the national project. It is no surprise then that for many women, excuse me, it is no surprise then that for many women, frustrated by their lack of access to significant roles in politics or business for the previous half century, the war seemed to provide exciting opportunities to improve their status and their relevance in the eyes of society and the government. So once again, that society that I keep mentioning, the Nippon Kyoiku Kamishibai Kyokai, the Tokyo production company that produced the majority of propaganda Kamishibai plays. So this company recruited female playwrights and film script writers to create plays intended to appeal specifically to women, notably these three very talented writers, Inaniwa Keiko, Suzuki Noriko, and Yoshida Haru. There were fewer women illustrators of plays. In fact, I think I've only seen one. But as I mentioned earlier, young women were recruited to perform propaganda Kamishibai plays, particularly those that featured women or girls as protagonists. Using my own collection of over 100 wartime Kamishibai plays as my database, I estimate that about 40% of wartime plays were either directly about and targeting women or had secondary but still important female characters who conveyed propaganda messages and provided admirable examples for viewers to emulate. Some of the repeated visual tropes or storylines that we see in plays for women include women in hoods and monpe, fearlessly fighting fires, women in kappogi aprons, these white aprons with the long sleeves. And as we shall see, messages about appropriate clothing are a frequent subject, or sometimes right on the surface, frequent subtext, or sometimes right on the surface of many Kamishibai plays for women. So what they have on their bodies matters. Historian Wakakuwa Midori has explained what the kappogi apron signified in wartime Japan. She writes, "The apron was a sign that virtually epitomized adult women during the 15-year war. It was the trademark of the Women's Defense Association and was, moreover, a uniform that Japanese women were practically compelled to wear during wartime. What this meant is all too obvious. These cooking aprons were work clothes specific to the household. Normally, women did not wear the aprons when they left the house. An apron was originally a piece of clothing to be worn temporarily while doing housework. It is highly significant that clothes for household labor should become a uniform to be worn outside. It means that the entire active identity of women was expressed by home labor. A uniform is, by definition, meant to erase individuality and promote unity for the sake of the group. But the fact that in order to be acknowledged as useful by society, women had to wear not their street clothes, but their household work clothes makes it clear that the message was, women's place is still in the home," end of quote. In other words, despite the fact that many women saw the war as an opportunity to make social and political progress, the implicit but ubiquitous message to adult women was that their contribution to the war effort was meant to grow out of their traditional household roles as wives and mothers. It is not surprising, therefore, to find that another very common trope in wartime Kamishibai was that of women, usually widows, sacrificing themselves for their young sons' education and well-being. So much so, they sacrifice themselves for their young son's education and well-being so that by the end of the play, when the son has grown up, he can join the military and give his life for the emperor. One early example of such a play, Kushi, the comb, written by Inaniwa Keiko, includes a scene in which a soldier writes a letter to his long-suffering mother back at home that includes the line, "Mom, do you know why Japanese soldiers are so strong? It's because they are all thinking of their mothers." And again, we'll get back to this point in just a minute. So another trope that we see in women plays is just the idea of women who have lost sons. It's almost always sons, but sometimes another family member, going stalwartly back to work despite their grief, despite everything, they go back to work in factories or on farms. And again, we'll look more into this in just a moment. So we'll turn now to some actual plays so that you can see how these tropes actually play out. One of the most frequent messages aimed at young women was that their choice of clothing mattered. It was directly related to the successful outcome of the war. Kamishibai plays echoed government campaigns organized to convince young women to be content with old kimonos or with monpe, the loose work trousers worn over a kimono that you see in the right-hand picture here. The mother and her daughters are all wearing monpe. With slogans like the one we saw a moment ago, Zeitaku wa tekida, luxury is the enemy, or Hoshigarimasen, Katsumade wa, I won't wish for anything extravagant until we've won. With slogans like this, the government cautioned women, especially young women, against the wasteful use of goods that could better serve the troops. A play that typifies this message is Yoshida Haru's 1941 Tamao Senchie, which I translate as Bullets for the Battlefield, which is addressed to young farming women. And its purpose is to convince them not to desire stylish Western clothing, but rather to be content with their frumpy but practical monpe work clothes. The protagonist, Toshiko, is asked by her brother-in-law to come up to Tokyo to help take care of her older sister, who is about to give birth to her 5th child. Toshiko agrees, but only on the condition that the brother-in-law buy her a chic Western outfit in Tokyo. He's desperate to persuade her, so he agrees. After Toshiko arrives in Tokyo, she is a great help to her sister, but one day she asks her sister about the promised Western clothes. The older sister is surprised, and later she berates her husband for having promised something so extravagant. Toshiko overhears their conversation and cries, but she does not give up her wish for a Western dress. Her brother-in-law buys her the outfit, but continues to try to make her understand that this kind of spending is wasteful. Sitting with her sister, who has just given birth, Toshiko sees a newspaper advertisement for dangan kitte, that is, ammunition lottery tickets. And she explains to her sister, it's 2 yen to buy one, and if you win, the top prize is 1,000 yen. There are a lot of other prizes too. They promise to buy one for her, and her brother-in-law tells her that this is something worth spending money on, since the proceeds go to supplying ammunition to the soldiers. The scene shifts to Toshiko's home, back in the countryside, where her mother and friend are talking about the stylish outfit she will undoubtedly wear when she comes home tomorrow. But to everyone's surprise, Toshiko returns wearing the same old kimono as when she left. Moreover, the next day, back in monpe, she tells her friend that in Tokyo, many people wear monpe, but the Tokyo ones are not as nice looking as the ones in Toshiko's hometown. Soon, Toshiko sees in the newspaper that her lottery ticket has won. But because she is now reformed, because she's now understood the proper value system of wartime, she uses her money to go back to the post office to buy more ammunition lottery tickets. And then the play ends with this exhortation or advertisement for the ammunition lottery. This play is a focused attempt to encourage young women not only to save money and goods by eschewing Western clothing, but also to understand, at least implicitly, the meaning of their clothing choices within the discourse of total mobilization. Wearing the right clothing not only signals compliance with nationalist goals, but it enacts that compliance in an actually embodied way. The play's primary meaning is encapsulated in this final panel, which directly urges viewers to buy ammunition lottery tickets. But as in the case of most Kamishibai plays, there are multiple levels of ideological instruction happening all at once, explicit and implicit, visual and textual. And here we can get a hint of the potential effectiveness of Kamishibai as a medium of propaganda. In place of hackneyed government slogans, this play conveys its message through charming characters, as well as implying to its young female audience members that such moral behavior could potentially result in a very concrete reward winning 1,000 yen. But we also see how a single play could convey messages to several different demographic groups at once. Even though this play was primarily aimed at rural women of Toshiko's age, it would also have been viewed by city dwellers too, including women in their 30s. Those viewers might well identify with Toshiko's older sister, properly clad in kappogi apron over the same plain kimono in virtually every scene. And moreover, the mother of 5 healthy children by the end of the play. Sorry about the telephone. She embodies the government slogan, Umeyo fuyaseyo, bear children and increase the population, which implicitly means increase the population of potential soldiers. But once again, the slogan itself is never used in the play. A viewer who may have grown tired of direct exhortations in the form of government campaigns and slogans might well have been more effectively motivated through their absorption in a pleasant story like this. Let's now look at the very popular genre, the mother play, of which there were an enormous number. 2 of the most iconic of these were Gunshin no Haha, Mother of a War God, by Suzuki Noriko. This was written in 1942, 1 year after the Pearl Harbor attacks, and it commemorates that 1-year anniversary with this play about a young man, Ueda Sadamu, who was in a suicide submarine at that attack and properly died for his country. So this is based on a real life young man. And then the second of these is Mume no Haha, written 2 years later by Inaniwa Keiko. And it's about the opposite. It's about a young man who is completely unknown, his mother is completely unknown. And yet, as you will see, the basic structure of this play and the points that are emphasized, these 2 plays, the points that are emphasized are very, very similar. Both of these plays, like the vast majority of mother plays, depict the relationship of a mother and her son. In both cases, the mother also has at least 1 daughter in these 2 plays, but the girls play no significant role in the narrative at all. And as I just mentioned, both of these plays rely on very similar narrative tropes. First, we have mothers sacrificing themselves to support their sons, and the son's explicit recognition of and gratitude for that sacrifice. In the case of Gunshin no Haha, as we see here, the mother, Saku, gets up 4 hours early before beginning her backbreaking work on the farm to strip mulberry bark from branches to sell to paper makers to make some extra money. She does this to enable her son, Sadamu, to continue his schooling. When Sadamu awakens in the middle of a particularly cold night and finds his mother already busy at this tedious work, he notices that her fingers are bleeding, for example. He gazes at her with tearful gratitude, thinking, "My mother, who always does whatever is necessary to protect me. My mother, who always works on silently without a word of complaint, no matter how painful things are. Kind, gentle mother." And then we're told by the narrator that tears of gratitude welled up in Sadamu's eyes and moistened his cheeks. There's a similar scene early in Mume no Haha, where we find the mother, Oito, feeling overwhelmed by her situation as an uneducated widow with no adult relatives, somehow single-handedly caring for 2 children and her bedridden father-in-law. She's feeling dejected when up comes her young son, Chuichi, to award her a medal that he has made out of flowers in recognition of her constant love and support. Note in both cases, both plays, the close-up on the mother's face as she is gazed upon by her grateful and adoring son. Both plays also include important letters linking the now grown-up soldier sons to their mothers back home. In her first ever letter to her son, Oito, in Mume no Haha, explains that she has belatedly learned how to write just to be able to communicate with him. The humble love expressed in her letter moves Chuichi to whisper to her across the many miles as he imagines her face. He whispers, "Mama, what are you talking about? Do you believe I would be ashamed of my mother just because she has no education? My mother, who is to me the most precious, sweetest person in the world. My mother who put up with any amount of hardship in order to raise us kids. My mother who, thinking about us soldiers at the front, not only builds airplanes, but even learned how to write just so she could send encouraging words. Mama, please don't worry. I will not fail to repay your kindness by being useful here. Then another similarity. In both plays, the son dies. In Gunshin no Haha, Sadamu dies in a suicide submarine attack on Pearl Harbor on September 7th, 1941, but his death is not pictorialized. Chuichi, in Mume no Haha, dies in his buddy's arms on an island in the South Seas, an instance of that pietà trope that I brought up earlier. But in both cases, after the death, the sons are depicted as if apotheosized, right? As if they've turned into something different after death, different and marvelous and strange. Here's Mother of a War God, and here's Unsung Mother. And when these pictures are shown toward the end of the plays, the narrator in each case is waxing lyrical about their noble sacrifices. Finally, the similarities end with both mothers mourning briefly when they get the news of their son's death, but only briefly. Then they stand up resolutely and get back to work. Oito in the airplane factory and Saku on the farm. As the narration that goes along with these final panels reaches a crescendo of praise for the mothers of Japan who produce the strongest soldiers in the world. Here, for example, is the script for the final scene of Gunshin no Haha. The narrator says, Saku, the mother of a war god, carries in her heart the memory of a chief petty officer from bygone days, as she continues, just as she had done in the past, to carry heavy lumber on her back as she treads the morning dew of the high plateau. This image of this mother, she who has borne one of the 9 war gods of Showa, is indeed the image of the mother of Japan. And here's the script for the final scene of Mume no Haha. It's very similar. Look at this picture of a mother, the picture of a mother who brushed away her tears and stood up with determination. It is the image of this mother who silently, unknown by anyone, raised a strong child for her country, and who then, still unknown, worked with untiring zeal. The image of this woman, the unsung mother, she is the fount of strength from which flows the righteous fire of the 100 million, which will crush the American and British enemy. This play was by Inaniwa Keiko, and you may recall the line I quoted a moment ago from an earlier play by Inaniwa, Kushi, the Comb, about how Japan soldiers are so strong because they are thinking of their mothers. So this is the primary message delivered in these various mother plays. If you, mother, are constantly selfless and self-sacrificing to the point of willingly offering your son to nearly certain death in the service of the emperor, then not only will you bask in that son's adoration, but you will also serve the nation more fully than any other type of person could. So that's a very strong message to mothers. And I will conclude with one more mother play. This one is quite unusual. It's called Haha wa Manzaishi. My mother was a manzai performer, and it was written by Yoshida Haru in 1941. The play features an extremely charming and likable female protagonist who goes to the battlefield and comes under enemy fire. And the point of view, as you can see from the title, is that of a child vis-a-vis her parent. Haha wa Manzaishi tells the story of Manzo and Senko, who leave their popular Asakusa Manzai act to join a diverse group of performers traveling to China to cheer the troops. They leave their 13-year-old daughter, Nobuko, at home with her grandmother. And as Senko says goodbye to Nobuko and then begins immediately on the train to write her a letter, she is chastised by Manzo, her husband, who says that on this trip, Senko must think and act like a professional, not like a mother. In fact, because he is the troop leader of their tiny little 2-person troop, she must call him Dancho-san, which means troop leader, rather than the usual anata. Senko promises to try. Once in China, they are greeted with glee by the soldiers who are delighted to see a Japanese woman after so many months abroad and who thoroughly enjoy the Manzai act. Senko and Manzo are then asked if they would be willing to venture even further into enemy territory to entertain a troop pinned down in a dangerous area. They agree, but on the way there, they come under enemy fire. And we see the remarkable scene of Senko carrying a wounded soldier on her back to safety. As you might expect, however, Senko herself is shot soon after, and we see her dying in her husband's arms. As he begs her to shikkari shiro, to hang on, she opens her eyes and says faintly, Dancho-san, troop leader, and then she dies. The next thing we see, and I think this is brilliantly depicted, is the ominous scene of Nobuko coming home from school to find strange boots in the entryway. Nobuko manages to hold herself together, although her grandmother's prostrate with grief. She holds herself together while the guest tells her of her mother's brave death, just as brave and noble as that of any soldier. But then she runs outside, and the script tells us that pressing her face against the fence, she could no longer control her grief, and her tears poured out as she cried, "Oka-chan," mommy. And this is where the play ends. So as I mentioned, Yoshida Haru's depiction of the wife in this play is very appealing. Senko is witty, strong-minded, loving, brave even under fire, and thoroughly professional. The message to women viewers seems to be that if they can subdue sentimentality and serve the nation professionally and bravely, then even if they don't die from a bullet the way Senko did, their contributions to the war effort still can be considered as important as those of soldiers. The play is remarkable for putting a woman into several situations that are reserved exclusively for men in other Kamishibai plays. You will have noticed the repetition of the trope of one soldier carrying another on his back. Here we see Senko performing that same deed in her skirt and sensible but definitely feminine shoes. Another example is the scene where Manzo cradles the dying Senko in his arms, which echoes the familiar pietà trope, as we've seen from so many soldier plays. Disturbing and sorrowful as these images are, in propaganda Kamishibai, the death of the soldier is taken as a given, at least potentially. And with enough repetition, the viewer becomes at least somewhat inured to these deaths. But to see this tweaked so that it is not a male body in uniform, but a female body in civilian clothing dying on the battlefield is a powerful repurposing of this familiar image. Moreover, in the case of the soldiers, we rarely have any last words, or when we do, in Mume no Haha, for example, where the dying man invokes his mother, those words are broken and pitiful. Senko's last words, however, Dancho-san, troop leader, show both presence of mind and wit, affectionately teasing her husband as she dies in his arms. The power of such an appealing portrayal of female strength may have struck the censors, and for all I know to the contrary, the viewing audience, as a powerful inducement to women to emulate Senko's devotion to the cause. But when you think about it, it seems that this message might be undercut by the fact that the point of view of the play is that of Nobuko, the daughter, and we end with her heartrending grief. It's very hard to see any positive result for her in this narrative. And in a similar vein, I'd like you to once again consider the final panel of Gunshin no Haha, Mother of a War God, which shows Saku continuing her backbreaking labor of carrying lumber. She is looking down, and even as the narrator is waxing lyrical about her status as the mother of the nation, the expression on her face and that of her daughters is sadness or dejection. How could plays such as these, with very mixed messages about the cost of the war, have functioned to inspire women to do what the government required of them? I've written extensively about this and will not go into detail about it here. So I'm going to sum up very briefly to say that Kamishibai plays were among the only forms of entertainment quotation marks, in the final years of the war, and made use of multiple sensory paths to pull viewers into the emotional gestalt of the story. The script, which ranged from authentic sounding dialogue, often in local dialects, to high-flown patriotic rhetoric. The pictures, which, while sometimes deliberately somewhat primitivist, were often beautiful and evocative, and the performance, which might include heartbreaking songs at the most emotionally charged moments of the play, ensuring that the entire audience, whatever their private views of the war may have been, sobbed together as one. The resulting sense that the entire imperium was working, and more importantly, was feeling together in unison, was the overriding central goal of propaganda Kamishibai. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be very happy to hear your comments or questions.
Professor Orbaugh, thank you so much for your inspiring talk. We have quite a few questions, and hopefully we can answer as many as possible. May I begin asking you, as you pointed out, Kamishibai reveals its multiple and sometimes contradictory intentions and target audiences. To what extent did Kamishibai creators have the liberty of choosing their topic and content?
Yes, thank you. I can't answer definitively about that, but there are some pieces of evidence that might give us part of an answer. All Kamishibai plays were censored pre-publication, and censors also went to performances to make sure the performers did not in any way change the script or change the message. So in that sense, there was not a lot of leeway for Kamishibai creators to do what they wanted. Also, many Kamishibai plays, about a third of them, I would say, were sponsored by, for example, the Navy Ministry or the Okurasho, the Finance Ministry, to give specific messages. And in those cases, too, the messages, the creators were told what the messages should be, but then they had the liberty to put those into a story in any way that they thought best, or to illustrate them in any way that they thought best. So in terms of creating an effective narrative and effective illustrations, I think they had a lot of liberty because they were recognized as experts in this medium. But in terms of the kinds of messages they could disseminate, they had very little.
Great, thank you. If I could just touch upon your publication a little bit, the portrayal of Japanese women there is juxtaposed with those in Britain and the United States during World War II. In Japan, as you mentioned, luxury was the enemy, and Kamishibai really emphasized their moral clarity and pure-heartedness. Then one might argue this reflects Japanese cultural values, but it was a tremendous shift from MOGA or MOGA or modern girls in the 1920s. Were there any voices against the Japanese government's move to control their life all the way down to their clothing?
Mm-hmm. So in the Taisho period, there was a kind of blossoming, especially for women, of possibilities, of opportunities. New kinds of work, education became more accessible for women. There were more, when you have more educated women, you get more publications aimed at them. The world really kind of opened up. And as you mentioned, the Moga, or modern girl, was an icon in the 1920s. She dressed as she liked, didn't really care if people disapproved. So that was then in like the mid 1920s. Once we get to early Showa, in the late 1920s and the 1930s, all of that starts to shut down for women. And it shuts down with more and more active censorship and more active sort of propagandizing at women to be more frugal, to be the Nadeshiko image, that sweet, demure. That's a kind of image that is sold to women as what will attract men, what the soldiers are all fighting for. So everything becomes more controlled. That's one part of the answer, is that women just have less freedom to show themselves in the way that they like. And this didn't happen so much with women, but with writers, artists, other people who were actually trying to disseminate messages of resistance. There was not just censorship, but arrests, harassment, punishment. some demonstrators were beaten to death in prison by the special police. Some people call them the thought police. So things just shut down for women, and the kinds of images that they could entertain about themselves and the ways they could show themselves on the street became much more limited in the 1930s and particularly in the 1940s.
Thank you so much. I know this is outside your study focus, but we have received so many questions on this topic. For example, in your research of modern manga literature, do you see any common thread of Japanese women's role or their expected role from World War II to today?
So today is a little far for me to leap, but I'll try. You do see a lot of commonalities. So in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, Japanese women in popular culture and in women's fiction and so on, you can see a lot of resistance to wartime images of women. They don't want to be the Nadeshiko, and they're fighting against that. But in many cases in literature and even in manga, you see women, how hard it is to fight that, how hard it is to fight the ubiquity of those images and the strength of kind of the social pressure on women to stick within the roles of being a good wife, good mother, dressed demurely, blah, blah, blah. You know, in 21st century manga and other kinds of popular culture, I have seen some images of women who were successful and strong and did what they wanted and succeeded in business and so on. But again, far more often what you're seeing in, at least in things created by women, about women, is a sense of frustration and exhaustion at trying to fight those social forces. It's still a fight, it's still a struggle. That's my impression. We don't see any struggle in the propaganda images that I was just going through because they were so controlled, but you can see how strongly they're pushing one view of women, and people are still kind of fighting a view that is not that dissimilar. I'm sorry, that's a very pessimistic answer, and it's not entirely correct, I think, but that is definitely one thread that you still see in contemporary materials, is that it's so hard to fight this.
This might be the last question, but how do North American academic libraries best serve their Kamishibai collections for researchers and public students? Do you have any wish to these libraries?
Yes, I do, which is digitize everything and put it online and make it available to everyone. The Hoover Institution is right now, I know, digitizing Kamishibai collection, and it will be available at some point. Kanagawa University has a wonderful collection digitized that can be accessed. The National Diet Library in Japan has a huge collection, but you have to be on site to see the digitized versions. I'm in the process of digitizing my collection, but there are some copyright issues that need to be overcome, and copyright with Kamishibai is very complicated. The people who created these things, no matter how brilliant they were really not famous. And so you can't easily find their death dates to figure out when materials go out of copyright. But the organizations they worked for, the Nippon Kyoiku Kamishibai Kyokai, for example, which I mentioned several times, it's defunct. So in that sense, the materials ought to be available. So I would say what librarians and anyone who has such a collection should do is to get it out there as soon as possible. These materials are still very rare. They're hard to find. It's hard to find complete plays. Many of them were burned after the war. Many of them just disappeared over time. So for those people who have them, making them as widely available as possible for scholars and just people who were interested in reading the plays would, to my mind, be fantastic.
Great, thank you very much. We are coming close to the end of our time. Just for future events, we have a Professor Alice Tan talking about the visualization of the emperor, and in conversation with Professor Matthew Sommer. Professor Tan is from Art History Department at Boston University, and Matthew Sommer is at Stanford University's History Department. And we also have, that will be October 5th at 4 o'clock. And we have also the Professor Stefan Norris, the Professor of History and Director, Harvey Harsh Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies at Miami University. He will present Russian visual media and its Japanese depictions. That'll be at noontime on Friday, November 5th. Thank you so much for attending today's talk. We look forward to seeing you next time.